Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Frederick Rivera sat in his mahogany-paneled office, the city sprawling beneath his corner window like a chessboard waiting for his next move. At 42, he commanded respect in every room he entered, a self-made millionaire who'd built his security consulting empire from nothing. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing, a trait that had served him well in business and would prove invaluable in the coming months. The divorce papers lay before him, Lucia's signature still wet with the ink of betrayal. 20 years of marriage, reduced to legal documents and property divisions. But Frederick wasn't just any husband. He was a man who specialized in protection, in seeing threats before they materialized, in planning for every contingency. Except he hadn't seen this coming. Lucia Rivera, now soon to be Lucia Richards, had been methodical in her deception. Frederick's private investigator, Dallas Carson, had laid out the timeline with surgical precision. 6 months of secret meetings, burner phones, and elaborate lies. Her affair with Roger Richards, a smooth-talking real estate developer with more debt than sense, had been brewing while Frederick worked 16-hour days to secure their future. "She's been feeding him information about your business dealings," Dallas reported, sliding photographs across the desk. "Account numbers, client lists, security protocols. Richards thinks he's hit the jackpot." Frederick's expression remained unchanged, but his fingers drummed once against the desk, a tell that only those who knew him well would recognize. "And my children? Brady and Dawn are taking her side. They've been poisoned against you for months. Lucia convinced them you're a controlling tyrant who drove her away. Brady, his 20-year-old son, had been distant for months. Dawn, 18 and about to start college, had refused to even speak to him since the separation began. Lucia had played the victim perfectly, painting Frederick as an emotionally absent workaholic who cared more about money than family. The truth was more complex. Frederick had indeed been absent, but not by choice. 3 months ago, he discovered irregularities in his company's accounts. Someone had been systematically stealing client information and selling it to competitors. He'd been working around the clock to identify the leak, never suspecting it was his own wife feeding information to her lover. "There's more," Dallas continued. "Richards isn't just after your wife. He's planning to use the information she's given him to poach your biggest clients. He's already registered a competing business, Pinnacle Security Solutions." Frederick leaned back in his leather chair, a plan already forming. Roger Richards thought he was playing chess, but he was about to discover he'd brought checkers to a grandmaster's game. "I want complete surveillance on both of them," Frederick said, his voice calm as winter steel. "Every phone call, every meeting, every breath they take. And Dallas? Make sure they know I'm watching, but not how closely." That evening, Frederick returned to what had been his family home for 15 years. The Tudor-style mansion sat on 3 acres of manicured grounds, every security system state-of-the-art. Lucia had moved out 2 weeks ago, taking the children with her to Richard's downtown penthouse. The house felt different now, not empty, but purposeful. It had become his war room. In his study, Frederick opened the wall safe that Lucia had never known existed. Inside were documents, photographs, and recordings that would have made his wife's blood run cold. Frederick had been many things in his life: soldier, businessman, protector, but never naive. He'd been documenting everything from the moment he'd sensed something was wrong. The safe also contained something else, a detailed dossier on Roger Richards that Frederick had commissioned months ago when he'd first noticed the man's name appearing too frequently in Lucia's social media activity. What he discovered was enlightening. Richards was a con artist of the highest order. His real estate empire was built on borrowed money and false promises. He'd been married twice before, both marriages ending when his wives discovered his true nature. But most importantly, he had a weakness, a gambling addiction that had cost him everything twice before. Frederick pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number in Las Vegas. "Jimmy? It's Rivera. I need you to set up a private poker game. High stakes. Make sure Roger Richards gets an invitation he can't refuse." Chapter 2. The Trap Springs. 3 weeks later, Lucia stood in the kitchen of Roger's penthouse, her new engagement ring catching the morning light. At 38, she still turned heads, her auburn hair and green eyes as striking as the day Frederick had met her. But beauty had always been her weapon, and Frederick was no longer her target. "The divorce will be final next month," she told Roger as he adjusted his tie. Frederick's being surprisingly cooperative about the settlement. Roger Richards was handsome in a superficial way, tall, silver-haired, with a kind of smile that sold million-dollar properties to people who couldn't afford them. "Probably feels guilty about neglecting you all those years. His loss is my gain." What neither of them knew was that Frederick had been orchestrating every move of the divorce proceedings. Through his lawyer, Dwayne Parrish, he'd structured the settlement to appear generous while actually protecting his most valuable assets. Lucia would get the house, a substantial alimony payment, and what appeared to be half of his liquid assets. In reality, she'd be getting less than a quarter of his true worth. Brady and Dawn had been visiting their father less frequently, their relationship strained by months of Lucia's careful manipulation. But Frederick was patient. He knew his children well enough to understand that they were being used, and eventually they would see the truth. The first crack in Lucia's facade came when Roger's gambling problem resurfaced. Frederick's associates in Las Vegas had done their job perfectly. Roger had been invited to an exclusive game with a credit line that seemed too good to be true. It was. Within a week, Roger owed $500,000 to people who weren't known for their patience. When he came to Lucia, desperate and sweating, she made the mistake Frederick had been waiting for. "We'll use the information from Frederick's files," she suggested. "You said you could get his client list to start your own company. Maybe we can sell some of that information to raise the money." It was exactly the kind of illegal activity Frederick needed to document. His surveillance team, led by Manuel Marquez, captured every word through the sophisticated listening devices they'd installed throughout the penthouse. Meanwhile, Frederick had been building relationships with his children in subtle ways. He'd arranged for Brady to get an internship at a legitimate security firm, one that wasn't connected to Frederick's business. Through this internship, Brady began to understand what his father actually did for a living: protecting people, securing their assets, keeping them safe. Dawn's awakening came through a different route. Frederick had quietly been funding a scholarship program at her college, focusing on students from broken homes. When Dawn learned about it from a friend, she began to question the narrative her mother had fed her about Frederick's character. "Dad's been helping kids whose parents can't afford college," Dawn told Brady during one of their visits to the penthouse. "Mom said he never cared about anyone but himself." Roger, overhearing, was quick to redirect. "People like your father do charity work for tax breaks and publicity. It doesn't mean anything." But the seeds of doubt were planted. Frederick was careful not to push, letting his actions speak for themselves. He knew that direct confrontation would only drive his children further away. The second phase of Frederick's plan involved his business rival, Kim Robertson, who ran the city's other major security firm. Robertson had been trying to destroy Frederick's reputation for years, spreading rumors about his methods and attempting to poach his clients. Frederick decided to give Robertson exactly what he wanted, or so it would seem. Through a series of carefully orchestrated leaks, Frederick made it appear that he was vulnerable, that the divorce had left him distracted and his business weakened. Robertson took the bait, launching an aggressive campaign to steal Frederick's clients just as Roger Richards was preparing to do the same. What neither Robertson nor Richards knew was that Frederick had been feeding them false information about his client base. The companies they thought they were poaching were actually shell corporations Frederick had created, complete with fake executives and fabricated security needs. "They're going to make their move soon," Dallas reported during one of their weekly meetings. "Richards has been showing Lucia's information to potential clients. Robertson's been doing the same with what he thinks he knows about your operations." Frederick nodded, watching through his office window as storm clouds gathered over the city. Let them. The deeper they dig, the more they'll expose themselves. The third week of April brought the first public humiliation. Roger's gambling debts had become common knowledge in certain circles, and his creditors were growing impatient. When he tried to use the stolen client information to secure a loan against future earnings, he discovered that every contact led to a dead end. The wealthy executives he thought he was impressing turned out to be actors Frederick had hired. The lucrative contracts he was certain he could steal were sophisticated fabrications. Roger had bet everything on information that was worthless, and now he owed money he couldn't possibly repay. Chapter 3. The Web Titans. By early May, cracks were showing in Lucia and Roger's relationship. The stress of his gambling debts, combined with the failure of their business scheme, had made Roger increasingly volatile. Lucia, for her part, was beginning to realize that the man she'd thrown away her marriage for was not the successful businessman he'd pretended to be. Frederick, meanwhile, had been subtle in his approach to winning back his children's trust. He never spoke ill of their mother, never tried to turn them against Roger directly. Instead, he simply continued being the father he'd always been, reliable, protective, and supportive. When Brady's car broke down on a Friday night, it was Frederick who came to pick him up, no questions asked. When Dawn needed help with a research project about corporate ethics, Frederick provided resources and guidance without lecturing her about her living situation. "I don't understand why Mom says such terrible things about Dad," Dawn confided to Brady after Frederick had spent an entire Saturday helping her move furniture in her dorm room. "He's never been anything but good to us." The turning point came when Roger's creditors decided to apply pressure. Frederick had been monitoring their communications, and he knew they were planning something dramatic. He also knew exactly when it would happen. On a Tuesday evening in mid-May, while Lucia was at her book club and the children were at school, 3 large men visited Roger's penthouse. Frederick's surveillance team captured everything: the threats, Roger's breakdown, and most importantly, his admission that he'd been lying about his financial situation from the beginning. "I thought I could make it work," Roger sobbed to the men who were systematically destroying his expensive furniture. "The woman I'm with, her ex-husband has money. I thought I could get access to his accounts." Frederick watched the footage with grim satisfaction. Roger wasn't just a con artist. He was a pathetic one. And now his children would see exactly what kind of man their mother had chosen over their father. The footage found its way to Brady and Dawn through an anonymous email account. Frederick was careful to make it seem like a concerned friend had sent it, someone who wanted them to know what kind of danger their mother might be in. The effect was immediate and devastating. Brady called Frederick within an hour, his voice shaking with rage and confusion. "Dad, we need to talk. Now." Frederick met his children at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant where they could speak privately. For the first time in months, he saw his real children in their eyes, not the resentful strangers Lucia had tried to create. "Why didn't you tell us?" Dawn asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you warn us about him?" Frederick's response was measured, careful. "Because you needed to discover the truth for yourselves. If I told you, you would have thought I was just trying to turn you against your mother." Brady slammed his fist on the table. "He's been using us. Using Mom. God, Dad, what if he hurts her?" "He won't," Frederick said quietly. "I won't let that happen." That night, Brady and Dawn moved back into their father's house. Lucia returned to the penthouse to find her children gone and a note explaining that they knew about Roger's debts and his plans to exploit Frederick's business information. Roger's reaction was predictable. Cornered and desperate, he lashed out at Lucia, blaming her for the failure of their scheme. The argument was loud enough for neighbors to hear, and someone called the police. By morning, Roger had been arrested for domestic disturbance, and Lucia had spent the night in a women's shelter. Frederick's response was swift and strategic. He appeared at the shelter the next morning, not as a vengeful ex-husband, but as a concerned father who wanted to ensure his children's mother was safe. "Lucia," he said when she agreed to see him, "the children are worried about you. Whatever's happened between us, you're still their mother." She looked terrible, bruised, exhausted, her carefully maintained appearance shattered. "Frederick, you don't need to explain anything to me," he said, "but you do need to get somewhere safe. Roger's in more trouble than you know." It was then that Frederick revealed part of his knowledge. Not everything, but enough to terrify her. Roger owed money to dangerous people. He'd been lying about his business success, and now that his scheme had failed, Those people would be looking for other ways to collect their money. They might come after you, Frederick warned. They might think you have access to money through our divorce settlement. The color drained from Lucia's face. What should I do? Frederick's expression was kind, almost gentle, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Come home. Let me protect you and our children until this is resolved. Chapter 4. The Safe's Revelation. Lucia returned to the family home that evening, humbled and frightened. The children were relieved to have their family back together, even under such circumstances. Frederick, ever the gracious host, prepared the guest room for Lucia and made it clear that she was welcome to stay as long as necessary. Roger, meanwhile, had been released on bail, but his world was crumbling. His creditors were closing in, his business was exposed as a fraud, and now he'd lost Lucia as well. But Roger was nothing if not persistent in his delusions. He convinced himself that if he could just get his hands on some of Frederick's money, he could solve all his problems. Frederick knew this, of course. He'd been counting on Roger's desperation to drive him to one final, fatal mistake. The house had returned to an almost normal routine. Brady and Dawn were relieved to have their family together, even if the circumstances were complicated. Lucia was subdued, clearly processing the reality of how thoroughly she'd been deceived. Frederick was patient, kind even, but there was a distance in his manner that hadn't been there before their separation. On Thursday evening, Frederick made an announcement at dinner. I have to fly to Chicago tomorrow for a client meeting. I'll be back Saturday evening. Will we be safe here? Lucia asked, the fear evident in her voice. The house has the best security system money can buy, Frederick assured her. And Dallas will be monitoring everything remotely. You'll be perfectly safe. What Frederick didn't mention was that he wouldn't actually be going to Chicago. Instead, he would be in a hotel room 20 minutes away, watching everything that happened in his house through the extensive surveillance system he'd had installed months ago. Friday afternoon, while Frederick was supposedly boarding a plane to Chicago, Roger was making his own plans. His desperation had reached a breaking point. The men he owed money to had given him until Monday to produce payment, or they would begin collecting in other ways. Roger had been in the house enough times during his relationship with Lucia to know the layout. He'd also noticed that Frederick had a safe in his study, an old-fashioned combination safe that looked like it might contain cash, documents, or other valuables. That evening, Lucia and the children settled in for a quiet night. They ordered pizza, watched a movie, and by 11 o'clock, everyone had gone to bed. The house was dark and quiet, exactly as Roger had hoped it would be. At 2:30 a.m., Roger used the garage code Lucia had given him months ago to enter the house. He moved carefully through the familiar hallways, his phone's flashlight providing just enough illumination to guide him to Frederick's study. What Roger didn't know was that Frederick had changed all the security codes the day Lucia moved back in. The old code had triggered a silent alarm that went directly to Frederick's phone, and every camera in the house was now recording. Roger found the study easily enough. The safe was exactly where he remembered it, built into the wall behind Frederick's desk. It was an older model, the kind that Roger thought he might be able to crack with enough patience. What Roger also didn't know was that Frederick had left him a present. On the desk, partially hidden under some papers, was a piece of paper with what appeared to be the safe's combination written in Frederick's handwriting. Roger's hands shook as he entered the numbers. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside, Roger found exactly what Frederick had intended him to find. The first thing he saw were stacks of what appeared to be cash, enough to solve his immediate debt problems. But as Roger reached for the money, he realized it wasn't real. The bills were movie props, convincing from a distance, but obviously fake when examined closely. Behind the fake money were photographs. Hundreds of them. Roger recognized himself in most of them. Meeting with Lucia, accepting information about Frederick's business, gambling in Las Vegas, being threatened by his creditors. Every illegal, immoral, or embarrassing moment from the past 6 months was documented in stunning detail. But the photographs weren't the worst discovery. At the bottom of the safe was a thick manila envelope with Roger's name written across it in Frederick's precise handwriting. Inside was a complete dossier on Roger's life, going back 20 years. Every failed business, every bad debt, every woman he'd conned and discarded. Frederick knew everything. The final item in the safe was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Mr. Richards, by the time you read this, you have already committed breaking and entering, attempted theft, and violated the terms of your bail. Everything you have done tonight has been recorded and will be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. You have until Monday at noon to turn yourself into the police and confess to your crimes. If you do not, I will release everything I know about you to your creditors, your ex-wives, and the media. You will never contact my family again. You will never use any information you obtain from my wife. You will disappear from our lives completely. This is not a negotiation. F. Rivera. Roger stood frozen in the study, the envelope trembling in his hands. Behind him, a voice spoke from the darkness. I told you he thought I was sleeping. Roger spun around to find Frederick standing in the doorway, very much awake and very much in control. The garage code you used was deactivated weeks ago, Frederick continued, his voice calm and conversational. The moment you entered that code, it sent an alert to every security system in the house. Every camera, every microphone, every sensor has been recording since you arrived. Roger's face had gone pale, his usual smooth confidence completely shattered. Frederick, I can explain. No need, Frederick interrupted. I have everything I need. The break-in, the attempted theft, the violation of your bail terms. That's probably enough to send you to prison for several years. You can't. I can, and I will, unless you do exactly what that letter says. Turn yourself in Monday morning. Confess to everything. Serve your time quietly. And never, ever contact my family again. Roger looked around the study desperately, as if searching for an escape route. But Frederick had anticipated every possibility. The house was surrounded by security personnel, the police were already on their way, and every avenue of escape was blocked. What about Lucia? Roger asked desperately. She helped me. She gave me the information. Frederick's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. My wife was manipulated by a professional con artist. She made mistakes, but she was a victim of your lies. You, however, are exactly what you appear to be, a predator who targets vulnerable women. The sound of sirens grew louder outside. Frederick had timed everything perfectly. The police will be here in about 3 minutes, Frederick said. You have a choice. Come quietly now and stick to our arrangement, or try to run and face the full consequences of every crime you've committed in the past year. Roger's shoulders sagged in defeat. He was beaten, and he knew it. Chapter 5. The Unraveling. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood that had settled over the Rivera household. Roger had indeed turned himself in, just as Frederick had instructed. The local news covered the story with the kind of breathless sensationalism usually reserved for celebrity scandals. Local real estate developer arrested for multiple fraud charges. Lucia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the newspaper without really reading it. The past 3 days have been a whirlwind of police interviews, legal consultations, and painful conversations with Brady and Dawn. The children had been supportive but distant, clearly struggling to understand how their mother could have been so thoroughly deceived. Frederick entered the kitchen, dressed for work as if this were just another ordinary Monday. His composure was unshakable, his manner toward Lucia polite but distant. The divorce papers are ready for final signatures, he said, pouring himself coffee. Dwayne says we can finalize everything by the end of the week. Lucia looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Frederick, I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just about Roger, but about everything. I destroyed our family for a lie. Frederick sat across from her, his expression unreadable. You made choices, Lucia. We all did. Now we deal with the consequences. Is there any chance? She began hopefully. No. Frederick's voice was final, absolute. There isn't. The word hung in the air between them like a door slamming shut. Lucia had hoped, despite everything, that Frederick might be willing to consider reconciliation. After all, he protected her from Roger's creditors, allowed her back into the house, been kind to her in her moment of crisis. But Frederick Rivera was not a man who forgave betrayal. He'd shown her mercy, yes, but mercy was not the same as forgiveness. He'd protected her because she was the mother of his children, because it served his own purposes, and because it was the right thing to do. But the trust between them was broken beyond repair. "What about the children?" Lucia asked. "How do we handle custody? Brady is 20 years old and can make his own decisions. Dawn will be 18 in 2 months and head into college. I think they're old enough to choose where they want to live and how much contact they want with each parent." It was a diplomatic answer, but Lucia understood the subtext. The children had seen their mother's judgment fail spectacularly. They'd watched her choose a con artist over their father, then stand by while that same con artist plotted to steal from their family. Forgiveness might come eventually, but trust would take much longer to rebuild. That afternoon, Frederick met with Dallas Carson to wrap up the surveillance operation. The evidence they gathered was comprehensive, enough to ensure Roger would spend several years in prison and face civil lawsuit from his other victims for decades to come. "Kim Robertson is backing down from his poaching attempts," Dallas reported. Turns out, when he realized he'd been chasing fake clients, he understood he'd been outmaneuvered. He's actually reached out about establishing some kind of cooperation agreement. Frederick nodded. Robertson wasn't evil, just competitive. Now that he understood the depth of Frederick's strategic thinking, he was smart enough to want to be an ally rather than an enemy. And the children? Brady's been asking questions about the family business. I think he might be interested in learning the security trade. Dawn's been researching criminal justice programs at her college. Roger's crimes seem to have sparked an interest in law enforcement. Frederick allowed himself a small smile. His children were resilient, intelligent, and apparently had inherited his sense of justice. They would be fine, but there was still one more piece of business to complete. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. Wednesday evening, Frederick called a family meeting in the living room. Brady and Dawn sat together on the couch, while Lucia took a chair across from them. Frederick remained standing, looking every inch the patriarch, making a final judgment. "I want everyone to understand what happens next," he began. "The divorce will be final Friday. Your mother will receive the settlement we agreed upon, the house, alimony, and her share of the liquid assets." Lucia looked surprised. After everything that had happened, she'd expected Frederick to try to reduce the settlement or find ways to punish her financially. However, Frederick continued, "There are conditions." Lucia's expression grew wary. "First, you will never discuss my business operations with anyone outside this family. What you learned about my clients, my methods, or my finances dies with you. This is not negotiable." Lucia nodded quickly. She'd learned enough about Frederick's capabilities to know that crossing him would be foolish. "Second, if you ever remarry or become involved with someone seriously, I will conduct a complete background investigation on that person. If I find they pose any threat to our children or to you, I will act accordingly." "Frederick, that's me protecting my family," he said firmly. "Your judgment in partners has proven questionable. I won't allow our children to be put at risk again." Brady and Dawn exchanged glances but didn't object. They'd been traumatized enough by the Roger situation to appreciate their father's protective instincts. "Third, and this is the most important condition, you will rebuild your relationship with our children on their terms, not yours. You will not attempt to manipulate them, guilt them, or turn them against me. If you violate this condition, I will pursue full custody of Dawn until she turns 18, and I will ensure Brady understands exactly how you try to use him against me." Lucia's face went pale. "I would never." "You already did," Frederick said quietly. "For months, you poisoned them against me while you were planning to steal from me. You used our children as weapons in your affair. That ends now." The room fell silent. Even Brady and Dawn seemed shocked by the brutal honesty of Frederick's assessment. "Do you accept these conditions?" Frederick asked. Lucia looked around the room, at her children, who were watching her carefully, at Frederick, who stood like a judge waiting for her plea. She understood that this was not really a negotiation. These were the terms of her surrender. "I accept," she whispered. Frederick nodded. "Good. Now, there's something else you all need to know." He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. 3 months ago, I discovered that someone was stealing information from my company and selling it to competitors. I spent weeks investigating, thinking it was an employee or a hacker. It never occurred to me that it was my own wife. Brady sat forward. Mom, you were selling Dad's business secrets? Not selling, Lucia said quickly. Roger said he needed the information to understand how to compete legitimately. You were giving detailed client information to a man who intended to start a competing business, Frederick corrected. In the security industry, that's not just unethical, it's potentially dangerous. Some of my clients are under witness protection. Others are celebrities or politicians who receive death threats. Their safety depends on confidentiality. Dawn gasped. Mom, people could have been hurt. Frederick set the folder on the coffee table. Fortunately, I realized what was happening before any real damage was done. I fed false information to your mother for the past 2 months, and she passed it all along to Roger. Lucia stared at the folder as if it contained snakes. You knew? The whole time. I suspected early on. I confirmed it 6 weeks ago. Everything since then has been part of a controlled operation to expose Roger's true nature and protect this family from further damage. Brady looked at his father with something approaching awe. You orchestrated all of this? Roger's arrest, the fake client information, everything? Roger orchestrated his own downfall, Frederick corrected. I simply provided him with enough rope to hang himself. Men like Roger Richards are predictable. They always overreach, and they always make mistakes. I just made sure he made them where I could document everything. Dawn shook her head in amazement. Dad, that's incredible. Frederick's expression remained serious. It was necessary, and now it's over. He looked directly at Lucia. You have a chance to rebuild your life, to repair your relationships with our children. Don't waste it. Lucia nodded, tears streaming down her face. She understood now that Frederick could have destroyed her completely, financially, legally, socially. Instead, he'd chosen to give her a path forward, albeit one with very strict boundaries. What about us? Brady asked. The family, I mean. Are we going to be okay? Frederick's expression softened slightly as he looked at his children. We're going to be better than okay. We're going to be honest with each other, protective of each other, and loyal to each other. We're going to be a real family again. It was a promise, a threat, and a prophecy all at once. Chapter 7, Justice Served. 6 months later, Roger Richards stood in an orange jumpsuit before Judge Laureen Copeland, awaiting his sentencing. The courtroom was packed with his victims, investors he'd defrauded, women he'd manipulated, creditors he'd stiffed. Frederick sat in the back row, watching with quiet satisfaction as justice finally caught up with a man who'd spent decades avoiding consequences. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Mallory Stewart, had built an airtight case. Roger's crimes went far beyond his attempts to steal from Frederick's business. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of fraud spanning 20 years in multiple states. Mr. Richards, Judge Copeland said, her voice stern, you have pled guilty to 17 counts of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Your victims include 3 ex-wives, numerous business partners, and dozens of investors who trusted you with their life savings. Roger stood silently, his lawyer beside him looking resigned. There was no defense for what he'd done, no mitigating circumstances that could excuse 2 decades of systematic predation. The court sentences you to 12 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 8 years. You are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $2.3 million to your victims. Roger's legs seemed to buckle slightly. Even with good behavior, he'd be in his 60s before he saw freedom again. Frederick didn't smile as he left the courthouse, but there was satisfaction in knowing that Roger would never hurt another family the way he tried to hurt theirs. Meanwhile, Lucia had been quietly rebuilding her life. She'd moved into a modest apartment downtown, taken a job in a nonprofit organization, and begun the slow process of earning back her children's trust. Frederick had been true to his word. The settlement had been generous enough to ensure she could live comfortably, but not so generous that she could return to her previous lifestyle of leisure and indulgence. Brady had indeed joined his father's business, starting at the bottom and learning every aspect of the security trade. His experience with Roger had given him insight into how predators operated, making him particularly effective at threat assessment. Dawn had changed her major to criminal justice and was excelling in her studies. She told her father that watching him methodically expose Roger's crimes had inspired her to pursue a career in law enforcement. "I want to protect people the way you protected us," she'd said. The family dynamic had evolved into something stronger than it had been before the crisis. Frederick, Brady, and Dawn formed a tight unit based on mutual respect and shared values. Lucia remained on the periphery, grateful to be included, but understanding that her position in the family had fundamentally changed. One evening in late November, the four of them sat around the dinner table in Frederick's house. It had become a weekly tradition, family dinner every Sunday, where they could maintain connections and discuss their lives. "I got promoted to senior analyst," Brady announced. "Dad says I can start training for field work next month." "That's wonderful," Lucia said, meaning it. Her son had found his calling, and despite everything that had happened, she was proud of him. Dawn looked up from her textbook. "I've been accepted into the FBI's college internship program. If I do well, they might offer me a position after graduation." Frederick nodded approvingly. "You've earned it. Your professors speak very highly of your work." Lucia watched her family interact, noting the easy camaraderie between Frederick and their children, the way they included her but didn't depend on her approval. It was painful, but it was also what she'd earned through her choices. "Frederick," she said during a lull in conversation, "I want to thank you again for giving me the chance to be part of this. I know I don't deserve it." Frederick looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're the mother of my children. That will never change. But Lucia, understand this. The woman I was married to for 20 years no longer exists. That woman earned my forgiveness long ago. You are someone new, someone who must earn her place in this family one day at a time." It was harsh but fair. Lucia nodded, understanding that this was likely the closest thing to absolution she would ever receive from Frederick. Chapter 8. New Beginnings. 2 years had passed since Roger's sentencing, and the Rivera family had settled into their new normal. Frederick's business had grown substantially, partly due to the reputation he'd gained for thoroughness, and partly because word had spread about how he'd protected his family from a sophisticated con artist. Brady had developed into an exceptional security specialist, his experience with Roger having given him an almost supernatural ability to spot deception. Clients specifically requested him for sensitive cases involving potential fraud or manipulation. Dawn had graduated summa cum laude and accepted a position with the FBI's white-collar crime division. Her first assignment was working on a task force investigating romance scams, criminals who targeted vulnerable women online, much like Roger had targeted her mother. Lucia had found her own path to redemption through her work at the nonprofit. She'd become an advocate for victims of financial fraud, using her experience with Roger to help other women recognize the warning signs of manipulation. It was painful work, but it gave her a sense of purpose she'd never had before. Frederick watched his family's growth with quiet pride. His children had not only survived their mother's betrayal, but had become stronger because of it. They understood the value of loyalty, the importance of protecting family, and the consequences of broken trust. On a crisp October evening, Frederick stood in his study, looking at the safe that had played such a crucial role in Roger's downfall. He'd kept it exactly as it was that night, empty except for a single photograph of his family taken the Christmas before Lucia's affair began. Behind him, Brady entered carrying a cup of coffee. "Dad, there's something I've been wanting to ask you," Brady said. Frederick turned, noting the serious expression on his son's face. "That night when Roger broke in, when you confronted him in the study, you said you thought he was sleeping. But you weren't in Chicago at all, were you? You were here the whole time." Frederick smiled slightly. It was the first time anyone had questioned that detail of the story. "I was in the house," Frederick confirmed. "I've been monitoring everything from the basement security room. I knew Roger would come eventually. Desperate men always make desperate choices. So when you appeared in the doorway, you'd been watching him the entire time?" "From the moment he entered the garage. I wanted to give him every opportunity to incriminate himself completely before I revealed myself. Brady shook his head in admiration. You don't leave anything to chance, do you? In my business, son, chance gets people killed. In my family, chance gets people hurt. I prefer certainty. It was a philosophy that had served Frederick well throughout his life. He'd built his fortune by anticipating problems and preparing solutions. He'd protected his family by understanding threats and neutralizing them before they could cause damage. As autumn turned to winter, Frederick found himself reflecting on the lessons of the past 3 years. He'd learned that trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired, but that new relationships could be built on the foundation of hard-earned wisdom. He discovered that his children were stronger than he'd ever imagined, capable of surviving betrayal and emerging with their integrity intact. Most importantly, he'd proven to himself that some things were worth fighting for, even when the battle required patience, planning, and the willingness to sacrifice mercy for justice. The safe in his study remained empty, but Frederick's life was full of purpose, of family, and of the quiet satisfaction that came from protecting those he loved from those who would do them harm. Chapter 9. Legacy. 5 years after Roger's arrest, Frederick Rivera stood before a gathering of security professionals at the annual International Protection Conference. He'd been invited to speak about family security, and his presentation had drawn the largest audience in the conference's history. The greatest threats to our clients often come from those closest to them, Frederick told the assembled crowd. Betrayal is intimate. It requires access, trust, and knowledge of vulnerabilities. Our job is not just to protect against external threats, but to help our clients understand the risks that exist within their own circles. In the audience, Brady took notes on his father's presentation. He'd heard these principles countless times over the years, but he never tired of learning from Frederick's experience. After the presentation, father and son walked through the hotel lobby together. Your mother called yesterday, Frederick mentioned casually. She wanted to let us know she's been promoted to Director of Victim Services at the nonprofit. Brady nodded. His relationship with Lucia had stabilized over the years, built on mutual respect rather than the automatic affection of childhood. That's good for her. She's found something she's good at. She has. And more importantly, she's found something that matters to her. It was as close to forgiveness as Frederick would ever come. He could acknowledge Lucia's growth, appreciate her contributions, and wish her well, but the trust between them would never be restored. Dawn had called the week before with news of her own engagement to a fellow FBI agent she'd met during a joint task force operation. Frederick had already begun the background investigation that would ensure his future son-in-law was worthy of his daughter's trust. Some people think I'm too controlling, Frederick had told Dawn when she'd objected to his investigation. Some people haven't been through what we've been through, Dawn had replied. Check away, Dad. I trust your judgment more than my own when it comes to character assessment. It was a sad commentary on the lasting effects of betrayal, but Frederick was proud that his children had learned to value security over romance, substance over charm. That evening, Frederick sat in his study, the same room where Roger had made his fatal mistake years earlier. The safe was no longer empty. It now contained something far more valuable than money or documents. Letters from his children, photographs of family moments, and a journal he'd begun keeping after the divorce. In that journal, Frederick had written the lessons he'd learned from his experience. Trust is earned through consistency over time. It cannot be rebuilt with words alone. Family loyalty must be mutual. Those who betray, family forfeit the protection family provides. Justice delayed is not justice denied, if the delay serves a greater purpose. The greatest strength is the ability to wait for exactly the right moment to act. Mercy without accountability enables future harm. Children learn more from what we do than from what we say. Frederick closed the journal and looked at the framed photograph on his desk. Brady in his security consultant uniform, Dawn in her FBI graduation cap and gown, and Frederick himself standing between them. It had been taken 6 months ago, and it captured something the family photos from his marriage had never shown. Genuine pride, hard-earned respect, and unbreakable bonds. His phone buzzed with a text message from Brady. "Dad, just wanted you to know, I've never been prouder to be your son. Thanks for showing us what real strength looks like." Frederick smiled, genuinely this time. He'd set out to protect his family from a con artist and ended up teaching them the most valuable lesson of all, that integrity, once established, becomes its own form of power. The safe's secret had never been what Roger found inside it. The real secret was what Frederick had built around it, a fortress of family loyalty that could withstand any assault from those who mistook kindness for weakness. In the end, Frederick Rivera had done more than exact revenge on his betrayers. He'd created a legacy of strength, wisdom, and uncompromising standards that would protect his family for generations to come. Justice, it turned out, was not just about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation, turning a family's worst crisis into their greatest source of strength. Frederick Rivera had always been a man who specialized in protection. Now, he was a man who had learned that the best protection comes not from walls or weapons, but from the unshakable knowledge that those you love will never, ever betray you. And for those who might be tempted to try, well, they would discover what Roger Richards had learned in that study 5 years ago. Frederick Rivera never forgave betrayal, and he never forgot. But most importantly, he never let his guard down again. The safe remained in his study, a reminder of the night everything changed. But Frederick no longer needed its contents to feel secure. His real treasures, his children's loyalty, their respect, and their understanding of what family truly meant, were beyond the reach of any thief. Some wounds never heal completely, but sometimes in the scar tissue, you find something stronger than what was there before. Frederick Rivera had built his life around that truth, and it had served him well. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.